Uh, Thank you, Andy, and thank you, everybody. Greg is still in the computer. It isn't Groundhog Day. It was a month or two back, but yeah, we welcome Greg back. This time he's supported with David Woods and Ian Rose, and yeah, Slope Soaring special. So a lot of us intrigued about this. We will cover a bit later on what we're looking at over May, just to sort of get you don't disappear too quickly because we'll talk about what's happening in May. But for this evening, Greg, take it away, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, this will be the last time uh, guys will hear from me for a bit. We've got some other people teed up for silent flight stuff later in the year. So there'll be an F5J one, which is going to be put together by a couple of the guys who fly F5J who are really experienced and good pilots. So it isn't the end of silent flight, but I've done a few in a row now, and I would imagine people are getting bored and overexposed to me. So I will be standing back to tonight. So after this one. So tonight we're going to talk about slope soaring, and we've got a great panel. We've got Dave Woods and Ian Rose helping us tonight. If you're into slope soaring, you'll know Dave's been flying a long time, for over 40 years, and in that period with his brother Graham has designed some classic slope soaring planes like the Aeolus and the plane called the Smoothie and Concept, which lives on today as one of the best aerobatic slope soarers you can actually buy, which is a plane called a Raptor from ballast. And then we've got Ian Rose, and Ian probably started flying about the same time as I started to get really into competition flying. And I met Ian many years ago, 35 years ago. And I think he just joined National Air Traffic Control at that point, as his first job, which he stayed in and worked all his life. And I never forget sitting in a car with David and Graham on a wet, windy day at a pylon race, and Ian was sitting in the other car, and we just met him, and someone said, "Oh, he works for National Air Traffic Control." I said, "Well, I imagine he'll never have a mid-air then." So I remember saying that to David and Graham. So one of my questions for you later is, have you actually ever had a mid-air slope soaring? So
yeah, one or two.
So as with all the other presentations I've done, or we've done, rather than leaving the questions to the end, we will have a question and answer session at the end. We'll throw the mics open, because there's a lot, I would imagine, in the audience tonight. I can't see exactly who's in the audience, but there will be lots of people who've got great insight, understanding of models. So, please feel free to contribute. And also, as we go through the presentation, I'll stop and we'll take some questions. And I think there was a question that's already been answered, but really it's like last week's F5B presentation. It sort of went along a bit and it was a bit quiet from the audience, and suddenly the questions started coming in, and we opened that up to the panelists and we answered the questions, and I think it actually really changes the dynamic of the presentation. So probably most of us on tonight are old enough to remember Thunderbirds, and we were talking about it before we started. And they had a spin-off series called Joe 90. And for those of you who used to watch Joe 90, he used to sit in a chair and he would be given an assignment, and he might have to become a world-class skier or a crack shot or whatever it was. And the metal cage would spin around him and he would become an expert. So what I'm hoping tonight is, with some of the things that I say and some of the questions that come out from the audience, and maybe some of the comments that come out from the experts in the audience, you'll go away with a sort of Joe 90 experience, which is, a bit more about slope soaring and some of the things that can help you and make it more successful for you. So this is the agenda. We're going to talk about some models, some different types and where they're appropriate. In last week's, this is the first silent flight presentation that I did, it came up about Slope Hunter, and an excellent web page, and I'll show that to you tonight. We'll use my browser, so we'll flick out the presentation. But Slope Hunter is a really good page, but there's a lot more to having a good day out, and there's a lot of information on the internet available to us, which can really enhance your experience of slope soaring and make your day a good day out. I'll talk about weather forecasting, and these things that I'm going to talk about are the things that I use, and there'll be people again in the audience who may have better tips, better things that they can bring to the party and tell us as we go through. And then again, I think I was trying to work it out. I've been flying 45 years, and so we'll sort of talk about some useful tips for surviving a day on the hill, especially if you're a power flyer. or a silent flight pilot who's done lots of flat field flying, and you've never really been to a slope, there's some really good stuff. And then we'll have a conversation about trimming and ballast, because slope soaring is one of those disciplines where you can arrive at the hill and start flying in a 10 or 15 mile an hour wind with a plane, and as conditions change during the day, you can end up with it being 30 or 40 miles an hour wind speed, if not higher. But actually, if the plane's trimmed well and you've got a good selection of ballast, the flight envelope of a lot of aeroplanes is significantly enhanced with the use of ballast. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then one of the things that's really great about slope flying is slope aerobatics, and there's lots of different flavors of it or styles to it. So we'll have a chat about that. And then sort of finally, before the questions and answers, and funnily enough, we were online before everybody else came in. We were talking about our relationship with other people that use the slope. So I'm going to talk about friction-free flying and maybe how to navigate yourself through a day at the slope if there are paragliders, hang gliders, and also other model flyers who are flying completely different sort of aeroplanes to maybe the planes that you're flying, and how you can coexist with each other without having problems. So in the same way as power flying, there's been, I suppose, a revolution, and at an entry level, you've got some fantastic foam type aeroplanes, wood or molded. And slope soaring is for everybody. People learn to fly from beginner to intermediate and become expert, and quite often they then go on and take up power flying as well. And I would say that, I've said this a number of times, that if you ground yourself or start with slope soaring, quite often you become a very competent pilot, because you've got to turn left and right, because as you fly backwards and forwards on the slope, especially when you're first learning, a turn into the slope is virtually impossible, and quite typically ends up with a wrecked model. So you have to turn, as you go down to the left hand side of the slope, you have to turn out from the slope, and that's a right hand turn. And as you go down to the right hand side of the slope, you have to turn out to the left. So, and beyond that, a variety of conditions. As I say, you can have quite low wind speed to high wind speed. It can be quite turbulent on some slopes. So generally, as I say, when people learn as a slope soaring pilot, they become very competent flyers. And to keep your model in one piece, you've got to be very able. What I would say about learning, though, is like anything. If you're going to go slope soaring, I would suggest you don't go and try and fly on your own. If you're a beginner, you should try and seek out a soaring club, a soaring association, take advice from them about what's the right sort of plane, and get some lessons, get some buddy box flying, whatever it is, and get yourself confident before you try and go and fly on your own. Because unlike a lot of power flying fields, it's a mixed environment. It's got the members of the public there, got hang glider pilots, paraglider pilots, and on some slopes, we actually share the slope with full-size gliding clubs as well. So the whole concept of safety is even more heightened than a closed environment, private flying field. So, my suggestion was, if you're beginning or an intermediate pilot, absolutely go and join a club and get some lessons. And then it's so multifaceted, different planes. So one of the really sort of popular planes that people aspire to when they can get to a point where they can fly really well is to have what people call a sports model, or an F3X model, probably a derivative of a competition plane, an F3F plane that we've talked about in the introduction to silent flight. Then scale. I mean, everyone aspires, I suppose, to have a full-size glider if you're a pilot or a model flyer. And scale flying is very popular off the slope. PSS, which is power scales soaring, and we actually had an email, and I've got a separate slide about that. And then obviously aerobatic flying. It's cross-country flying, and then just recently, and I'm a member of the Ivanhoe Soaring Association, and we have a nostalgia day, which was the idea of the guy called Pete Beadle, who's a lot of people online tonight would know who he is. He was very active in the forums. Classic and nostalgia type aeroplanes back from 30, 40 years ago are becoming really popular again, and we'll talk a little bit about where you can get good versions of that. And then something that's very popular in slope soaring and not so popular maybe in power flying and thermal soaring are flying wings. It's very definitely something that is a trend in slope soaring, and there's a discipline which I haven't put on here. As I say, it's so multifaceted. which is slope combat, where you've got flying wings made from, I suppose I would call them ceiling tiles, but they're made from very durable EPP. And the objective is to knock the other plane out of the sky, and they can be up to 20 pilots in the sky. I've seen that. One of the problems with it nowadays is that slopes are so busy that there's a bit of a conflict there with safety and members of the public. But on private sites and very quiet sites, flying wings and slope combats can be a very popular thing. So, I mean, I suppose that I'll move on to the next slide, but we've got a couple of questions there. Is there anything in there that's sort of worth looking at?
Greg, you might want to look at the first one about mention of DS,
Yeah, okay.
And you might want to explain what DS is, just for those that we've spoken about.
Yeah, so if you tuned into the original it's a great question, Silent Flight presentation, we discussed that slope soaring has classically been what we call front-sided flying. So wind's blowing along, it hits the hill, rises up, it's got nowhere to go. So in the same way as, if you overtake a lorry on the motorway, there's a bow wave coming out of the side of the lorry, and it forces your car out of the way, and then as you go past it, that bow wave disappears. A slope is just a giant example of a bow wave. What we discovered in the 80s started to become noticeable, and as I said it in the introduction in the Silent Flight introduction to Silent Flight, is that when we started getting hatchback cars like Golfs and Maestros, which we were talking about earlier, it was very evident very quickly. You'd wash the car, drive along, and if the road was a bit wet, that the back windscreen would get really dirty quite quickly. And there's obviously a vortex at the back of the car, and that's because there's a boundary layer. And as the wind flows along the flat roof, and then the roof slides down at 45 degrees, you get this rolling vortex at the back of the hill, and it actually produces more powerful lift for the wind speed than you get at the front of the slope. It's actually quite difficult to fly in. It's quite difficult to enter. You've got to be very skilled. And the plane, you could almost argue the plane is traveling constantly downwind in this rotor, but it's being accelerated by an upward draft because the rotor rotates round and comes back up the face of the hill at the back of the main slope. And so, well, we talked about it, world records over 540 miles an hour now. And when we first discovered dynamic soaring, we used to use F3F planes. So there's a picture there of Ian with a red top on. That's an F3F plane that's capable of, on the front side of the slope, about 120 to 130 miles an hour. On the back side of the slope, it might be capable of 200 miles an hour. Probably the inhibiting factor would be at about 200 miles an hour, the tailplane would fly off. So
just to add to that, Greg, where I'm standing on that is actually an easterly facing slope with a westerly face behind it.
Right.
So that is actually a de-essable site, and it is in certain conditions quite good.
Okay, and Ian makes a very valid point there. With dynamic soaring, actually what you want is a hill that is that shape and erect. Now, one of the problems with that is it's quite hard to land on a hill like that. You have to quite typically front side land, do a slope side landing. So de-essing is something that sort of started to come about in the 80s. It's spectacular. It's this unforeseen massive amount of energy at the back of the hill, but it's not for everybody, and you need very specialized models for it. And when we go towards the end of the presentation, with that question, if we want to have maybe open the mics up at the end, we can ask more specifics about dynamic soaring, about, for instance, where you get the right types of planes, who makes them, where there are places in the UK to do that. We can answer that at the end. But I haven't put it in as an absolute main facet of slope soaring because it's not something that is completely accessible to a large majority of people that fly on the slope. Quite technical. It requires a high degree of skill to do it, and it requires a very specialized model to do it. So I've got some pictures of planes up here, and we talked about scale planes. We talked about PSS, the B-52. Ian there with a yellow plane, that's what I would call a sports plane or an F3X plane. It's a sort of plane that can do everything. It's fairly aerobatic. It can thermal soar really well, flying very light lift, but could be ballasted up to 3.5, 4 kilos quite typically. and flying 50, 60 mile an hour wind speeds. In fact, a lot of the modern slope soarers are like that. The scale plane and the Ian's plane and the aerobatic plane next, which is a Raptor, they're probably capable of flying in wind speeds over 60 miles an hour. The issue you've got is launching or actually standing on the slope at the time to fly those sorts of planes. And then top right, I put it on there for the comment about nostalgia. That's a Veron Impala. There'll be a lot of people here tonight who probably learnt to fly slope soaring with a rudder elevator plane, and it'd probably been a Grantler Dandy, a Veron Impala, Cambria Capstan, something like that. So absolute staple of learning to fly. Clark Weiss section, quite a lot of dihedral, very neutrally stable. If you dive the plane, if you got yourself into a panic, the best thing you do is just let go of the controls and the plane will probably just pull out itself. And then if you go to the bottom and the middle, the plane that's banking over, which is white and orange, is, I would say, more typical of the plane that I would suggest people, if they want to get into slope soaring and learn, and they've got some power flying under their belt, is that configuration of plane, that's actually a middle phase. And that's a Chris Foss design, that's a kit. Fantastic plane to learn to fly on, semi-symmetrical section. And then on the right there, that's a foam plane. Right, that's a Heron. Again, very, very good aeroplane to start on. It's got ailerons, lightweight, so you can fly it in fairly light conditions on the slope. And then just sort of mirroring what's happened in power flying with foam aeroplanes. A lot of foam aeroplanes and power flying, I suppose, they're defined as shockeys. They're either indoor aerobatic planes or they're outdoor light wind aerobatic planes, very, very high power to weight ratio. Slope soaring has become populated with really good designs, which I would say are the equivalent of shockeys. And that's a plane called an Ahi by Dreamflight. And Dreamflight make a number of planes. They make some flying wings, and they make a foam DLG. And the Ahi is incredibly light, very strong, simple plane, rudder elevator and ailerons, but it's capable of being flown on sand dunes, small cliffs, right up to the big hills. Bounce if you crash it pretty much generally. And it's got a massive flight envelope. It's not a cheap plane, but it offers a lot of performance for what it is, because it's a foam aeroplane. It's incredible design. Okay, any more questions at that point? Let's just have a look, see what we got here. On landing with full width ailerons, up or down to slow down? That's a really good question. Well, before we had multi flat wings, like the plane that Ian's got holding on his shoulder, where you've got aileron and inboard flaps, as we got computerized radios, we went to something called crow braking, not butterfly, and we used to put the ailerons up to induce more drag. But obviously don't put them up too much, because if you've got no upgoing travel, you'll have no aileron response, but you will get a significant pitch down effect if you put both ailerons up to reduce the drag of the wing. So you need to have some mixing on the tailplane, some up elevator, and you need to take that out. And always, if I'm flying a new plane, I've set up crow or butterfly on it, or so I'm testing someone's plane, the first thing I do after I've launched out and got the plane trimmed to fly level right to left is I check the landing mode to see if I deploy full up aileron or a partial up aileron, whether or not the compensation of the elevator makes it safe for me to land it. If it isn't, I would land without the butterfly or crow and then recalibrate it. So to answer your question, both ailerons up gives you good braking and also gives you good aileron authority. If you drop the ailerons, you will lose your aileron authority. Okay.
So, Greg, I think one of the questions that was asked was about beginner models, and you've covered the middle phase. There are some other options out there. So Stan Yo of Phoenix Model Products does a number of kits which get people into sort of a built-up aeroplane. And I think certainly locally to me, one of the things that the local clubs have been doing is they do use Zaggies and flying wings, foam flying wings, to get people going early on, because they are incredibly robust, but they're not always the easiest thing to fly. But on some of the more limited slopes, they are a good way of getting people going.
Yeah, and Ian, it's a great question, and it's a great answer from Ian. One of the issues with doing this presentation tonight is actually, despite the devastation of the model flying industry by Hobby King and so many model shops shutting down, we've actually still got some very high quality, knowledgeable model retailers in the UK, specialising in gliders. And the problem with it, if I start going through it, I will miss somebody out, and then I will offend somebody. But there's some great people, and they've got some great ranges of models. Top Model Check, they've got a bewildering range of aeroplanes that you can look at and bring in from. But as I say, we've got 174 people on tonight. I'm sure later on we can open that debate up about really what are good planes, whether you buy a foam plane like a Heron, or you buy a built-up nostalgia plane like a Bavarian Impala, which is incredibly easy to fly and learn to fly. But one of the problems with it is, very quickly, once you've conquered slope soaring, that plane will be redundant, and you'll want to move on to something else. So that's why I think a lot of people have learnt on the middle phase type aeroplane, because that used to come actually with a rudder elevator wing, and then you could go to an aileron wing with a fairly flat bottom section. I think he might have even done a semi-symmetrical section to it. So it's quite like a lot of sports. If you invest in something when you're a beginner, and you start to progress, that investment can become redundant very, very quickly.
Greg,
sports like that.
Can't just interrupt. Someone's mentioned that there's a white box on your screen all the time.
Yeah, it's a
Can you not just hit that cross?
I can't get underneath it because there we go.
Okay.
So it was just it's my pop-up on YouTube. Is that gone now? Perfect. Right. Thank you very much for that. There's something there as well. So we'll get rid of that now. So one of the asks that came through on email after the silent flight introduction was to just mention about PSS, and I didn't do it justice because I don't really know anything about it. I like PSS, and I look at the picture of that Antonov or whatever it is and think, is that a full-size plane or is that a model? It's incredibly realistic. But there's a fantastic PSS webpage, as you can see it up on the top there. And they, even through COVID last year, if you go on and look at this, they had some fly-ins at different places in the country. So if you're interested in PSS as a discipline itself, get onto this webpage, and they really have got a strong community. And apparently Phil Cook is the man now that runs it. And as I say, get online, get over to a fly-in, the whole of Orcombe or the Limb Peninsula. They're all over the place. And I must thank Michael Kitchen for pushing me to that, because we did have a lot of interest actually after the initial silent flight presentation about PSS. And then the other question that came up was about where can I get good nostalgia kit. And so I've done a bit of research, and these seem to be the four protagonists, but I'm sure the 175 people in the audience will prove me wrong and now bombard us with comments in the question and answer or in the chat about some other people. I've looked at some of these. They've got some really nice high quality kits there. So and this is a really big area, and I'll put a plug, which is the Ivanhoe Soaring Association has a nostalgia day, which is normally in August, and people are welcome to come along with that. And that's where you fly something that's from the 70s, 80s, like a Bavarian Impala, or there's a Stan Yo Sorcerer there. Another big area of slope soaring, if that's something that really interests you, building a traditional style model dating back from that sort of period of time, then there are some really good sort of things out there. Right. So we sort of talked about models, and I do really think probably towards the end of the presentation, that whole debate will open up again. I'm sure people will want to ask more about different model types and what's right maybe to learn and what's right to have as an intermediate plane. And we've all got personal opinions, and anything I say will be from my personal experiences. It doesn't mean it's completely right. There probably could well be better things. So John Greenfield mentioned that a lot of slope soaring pilots use something called Slope Hunter, and I'll show Slope Hunter in a minute. It's a great starting point, and it's very well populated with sites for the south of England. But there's a lot more to, I think, to getting in, having a good day out when you go slope soaring. It's quite an intricate thing. If you're lucky that you live close to White Sheet or the Long Mynd or the whole of Horcombe, or Ivanhoe Beacon, and you can pop up there, that's really great. You're very, very lucky. But most people who go slope soaring quite typically have to drive 30 miles, 60 miles to find a decent slope. And of course, unlike power flying, where you've got a flying field and it doesn't really matter which way the wind blows, the most essential thing for slope soaring is to find a face that the wind blows onto, and you can go and fly. And as we know, we live in a country where predominantly the wind is supposed to be southwesterly. If you have your local slope, which may be the White Sheet Club, for instance, for someone like Ian, then southwesterly winds seem to be few and far between, especially if you just built a new model and you're ready to test fly it. So being able to find different slopes and fly in different wind directions is quite important. But that brings a whole set of separate issues. So I'm going to take you through, we'll go onto the web in a minute, and I'll show you some things that you can do to really help yourself take Slope Hunter and some of the information that's out there and optimize you getting the best day that you can if you make a long journey to go slope soaring. And you know, when I say long journey, you know, 30 miles plus, rather than popping down to your local flying field, which might be 5 or 10 miles, and you know you're going to get perfect days flying if the forecast is good, because you know you've got a flat field and the runways are there and you can fly in any wind direction. So and it's the SAS motto, you know, that all the P's, piss poor preparation leads to piss poor performance. It's the same with this. I think if you're going slope soaring and you're spending the time to drive somewhere, and you're then going to be walking up a hill for half an hour to get to the top of the hill, the better prepared you are and the better you understand the environment, the location environment, you probably have a better day. So I'll come out of this and I'll launch my browser. And what I do is, if I want to go to a new site or someone suggests I go to a site, then I start to research the site. Now, we're not the only people that use slopes. We know that hang gliders, paragliders and full-size gliding clubs use slopes. So the first thing I would do is try to find out whether or not the slope that someone is talking to me about, which is a good place to go for a specific wind direction, has actually got some sort of hang gliding club or presence on it, a paragliding club, and I'll look at what they have got to offer. So we were having a conversation the other day about, and funnily enough, Dave, who was in and Mark were talking before we started about Ditchling Beacon and Devil's Dyke and places, which is a shared site. Now, Devil's Dyke is probably one of the best northwesterly facing slopes in the south of England. When it's northwesterly, it's a great place to fly. And we were talking at the slope the other day, and someone said, "Oh, yes, but a really good place to go and fly is Coombe Gibbet or Hack Pen, or it's actually called Ink Pen Hill." And I have driven past there on a number of occasions, and the road actually goes straight up the face, but I've never ever flown there. So I thought, well, I'll wait for a northwesterly, because everyone was telling me it's a northwesterly site, and I'll go and fly there when it's like that. So I went on to Google and I looked up this, I put in Coombe Gibbet, and I found this webpage. And if you go down, you'll see that this club has got this webpage with all of these sites that they fly at. And if you're from the area, from Marlborough or somewhere like that, or actually not far from where Ian is, a lot of these sites are sites that people fly model gliders at, as well as hang glide. And if we look at Coombe, we can click on there and it will take us to the details of that site and what they think about it. And it's fascinating. So they even mention where you can fly and can't fly model aeroplanes. And I think I can probably move that. Let's move that out of the way. So Coombe is there. So if I click here, it'll come up and it will tell me a bit about Coombe Gibbet, where you can fly, what wind directions are, and what the issues are, and when it's open. So, for instance, it's a bit like Swire Head down on the south coast. You can't fly there from the 1st of September to 1st of February. So the concept of thinking, oh, it's northwesterly, which is quite often an autumn or spring type wind, I'll go down and fly there, is killed off straight away because of the pheasant breeding season and shooting. You can't fly there from the 1st of September to 1st of February. So we immediately found something that would not have been on Slope Hunter. So as you go down the webpage more, it gives you grid references, and it actually talks about where you can fly relative to the model flying. And it's, you know, and it says that there's a relationship between the model flyers and the hang glider pilots, and where the gibbet is a thing where people were hung. It's pretty gruesome history to it. The model flyers fly to the east of it, and the hang glider pilots are supposed to fly to the left of it. So immediately you're starting to get information about this slope and whether or not it's feasible to fly. And they also then talk about the fact that on the northwesterly slope in the evening, you get what they call rendition lift, which is where it's probably best described. It's something to do with anabatic and katabatic wind, where the heat comes up from the woods at the bottom as the cold air starts to rush down the face from the top of the hill. And you get very strong thermic lift here. And they say it's quite dangerous in this area to fly. So again, if you're flying a lighter aeroplane, it's sort of worth knowing all these things. But the major thing that you can see just from this picture is that actually it's a northerly facing slope for model flying. It's not a northwesterly facing slope. So again, by just having a bit of a poke around on the internet, what we discovered is that it is not actually a northwesterly slope. So sorry if I keep moving this around. So then what I would do next, let's see if I can get to my move that banner. I don't know why I can't get underneath it. Let's click there. Sorry. I don't understand why that won't move. Right, so we talked about Coombe. So the next thing I do is I go onto YouTube and I put in the place that I'm going to fly, and I put Slope Soaring at Coombe gibbet. And I found this video. I'm not going to play it, but it's actually a guy who shot the whole of the hill using a drone, and there's overhead footage. And what you can then see is you can see the axis of the roads, what the shape of the slope is, etc. And then when you look at the footage of the hill, what you can actually see is it's actually a very shallow entry to the hill. It's a good hill for flying scale and slope models, scale sort of sport type models, but it's not a good hill for aerobatics. And also in some of the other videos, you can see the level of paragliding and hang gliding. So there's some fantastic information there that you can sort of prepare yourself and look about how you're going to react with the place and day, what the parking's like, etc. And I use Google Maps and Earth quite a lot as well. So in the introduction to silent flight, we had a gentleman said, "Oh, I live in Manchester," and so very quickly he said, "Oh, well, where are the slopes?" So I just did this Google search about paragliding in the northeast of or northwest of England, and this site came up, and you can see, just looking at that map, that he lives down here in Manchester. There's a plethora of slope soaring sites, and if you click on any of these icons, it takes you to fantastic detail about the hill and the access, and whether it's private land, whether it's national trust, where the model flyers are flying, etc. So, you know, my comment to you would be is that the internet is full of fantastic information that will give you a view, a virtual sort of view and tour of the hill before you go flying. So you know what the parking's like, how big the car parks are. So if you look at Coombe gibbet, the car park's very small. So if you were going to go down there, you'd want to be there before 10 o'clock. Especially with COVID, we know that slope soaring sites are absolutely awash with walkers at the moment. So there's things like that which will just make your day better. Okay, so let's go back to the slides. So do some preparation, find out whether or not the hill that you want to go to is flyable, find out whether you can park there, and whether or not actually it's suitable for you to fly the plane that you're flying. And if you look at some of that drone footage, one of the things you'll see about Coombe gibbet, it's got a fantastic landing area. If you look at other slopes, they've got a fence right at the back of the slope, so you can fly, but you have to be incredibly accurate to land. So if you're going to take a fast-moving flying wing that's got no air brakes on it, a Pro or a Butterfly, it's going to be difficult to land there. So back to my point, preparation is really important for you to have a good day out and understand the slope and who flies there, and what the relationships are between model flyers and the other users. So I'll move this back up. See if I can move this up. There we go. So one of the things that's really important for slope soaring, much so maybe than power flying, is understanding the weather. So I'll just take you through my sources of what I do with the weather. I use two sources for wind. I use XC Weather, which is a flying site developed for cross-country flying. And they use an app called Windy, and I shall show you some pictures of them. And then obviously rain's very important, and a lot of people use the weather office or the Met Office's rain radar. Now, I don't find the graphical interface very good on that, so I use a weather app called Weather Pro, and they really seem to have got an excellent piece of software which takes the interpretation of the radar and turns it into a moving map. It's really, really good. And I would say, because the data is coming from the Meteo Group and the Met Office, as you get closer to the day, if you look for convergence between what the wind is saying on XC Weather and the weather is saying from the Met Office, you'll get a good view about whether or not you're going to get a good wind direction and weather for the slope. So I'll move on and show you what those look like. So on the left there, that's from yesterday. That's the output of Weather Pro and the moving map of the radar, and the graphical interface on it is really exceptional, really, really good. And then XC Weather, I'm sure we've got, as I say, 174 people online here tonight. A lot of people use XC Weather. If you don't know about it, it's a cross-country weather forecasting site, and you can put your cursor on any of these arrows, and they represent either a weather station or an airfield in the UK. And if you click on that, it will give you a 5-day weather forecast, wind flow, precipitation, and temperature for that airfield. Okay. Very, very, very effective wind direction and weather forecasting web page. And we were talking about lift in the first presentation, and we were talking about dew points and the cloud engine and all that sort of stuff. One of the things that's on XC Weather is, if you click on it, it gives you what the dew point is versus the ambient temperature, and the bigger the gap between those two, the stronger thermal lift you'll get, which is something people say, well, that's not very important when you're going slope soaring, but actually if you go slope soaring and there's good thermals around, you get doubly strong lift. So my sort of takeouts from that is, understand the slope that you're visiting, approach local clubs and see if there is a local club that flies there. So we were talking about the Wessex Soaring Association and some private sites that they've got down by Wyn Green, and there's most of these private clubs are very happy for you to go along and fly as a day flyer. You don't have to be members. So the Leeken Moorland, for instance, that's one that we've mentioned before. They're private sites. You just can't rock up and fly without being a member. But if you contact them, they're very happy for you to go and fly. But also they're experts on their local sites. And also, because we have this mixed relationship with we need to understand where we sit with that, rather than just turning up and flying and probably or possibly ruining a local flying club's relationship with the landowner or the National Trust, whoever it is. And then when you arrive at a slope, one of the things that's really important is to fly with the guys that know the slope really well. And I'll give you an example of that. I went up to a competition in Scotland and I flew on a magnificent hill. It's for an F3F competition. And I sort of really excited about getting there. The wind was blowing 30 miles an hour. It was absolutely booming lift. So I put my model together, put all the ballast in it and chucked off and started flying and having a pre-practice before the competition. And I went to land and one of the local flyers walked over to me and said, if you just walk 50 meters further to the left, he said, you won't crash when you're landing. He said, there's no rotor there, but if you land where you're standing, I guarantee you'll break your aeroplane. So what I should have done is, in my excitement to get going, I should have held myself back and said to the guys, where's the best place to land? Are there any issues, etc.? So, absolutely, you've got all this fantastic information from the local people. And then depending on what you're flying, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but in terms of launching and things, pick your moment. If you've got a plane that's maybe a bit light for the conditions, it's windy, or you're on a slope with a very steep edge. So we see it at Ivinghoe on quite a regular basis. People turn up and they go and stand to launch on the front and they don't really quite get to the edge. They throw the plane and it doesn't quite make it into the slope lift. And quite often it actually balloons up and lands behind and brakes. If you just walk down the front of the slope a little bit, there's a sort of 2 tiers to the slope. First of all, the wind's significantly less there, and it's less turbulent, and you tend to launch and get away and get a nice clean launch. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, on a really busy slope, I want to say pick your moment. If you're not sure about a new site and there's quite a number of people flying, either wait for a bit of a gap in the cadence of people flying, or say to people, hey, I'm new to the slope, do you mind I'm about to launch, can you just give me a moment to get out? And you'll find most people are really helpful. And then, I put this in here, and it's a really big issue, which is because of our mixed use and separation, Article 16 is really important for slope soaring. And then if we don't do the right things, we will lose many of our slope sites. So, my takeout on it is when you go flying, if there's paraglider pilots there, there are model flyers there, go and talk to people and find out what's going on and where you can fly and where they think you can fly. And paraglider pilots and hang glider pilots will tell you that you probably quite often say, oh, you're not allowed to fly here. So if you've done your research on some of those web pages and you can fly there, then you know to have the conversation back. But also, once you start talking to people, actually, it can be quite helpful. And they're shocked if you go over and have a conversation with them and say, hey, I'm going to fly here. I'll keep an eye out for you, etc. And you break the ice with them, you have a much better rapport than just chucking a plane off and start whistling it around a bunch of paragliders. So, we've got one question. So you mentioned butterfly for landing. Is that recommended rather than using crow? I never know the difference. I think crow means the ailerons go up, butterfly means the ailerons go up and the flaps go down. Ian and Dave?
Yeah. That's pretty much where I am.
Okay. All right.
Can I just pick up something you said earlier, Greg? So I fly a couple of mixed-use sites, and it's really interesting talking to the paragliders and hang gliders, because quite often you go out flying and it's either paraglider weather or hang glider weather. And the modern hang gliders are quite spectacular. So the last time I was flying, the local club near Weymouth, a lot of the guys are flying German hang gliders, which have technology that is very similar to what we are using in terms of the materials. And it's a very interesting starting point for a conversation. And quite a lot of the guys who fly hang gliders and paragliders in my neck of the woods certainly actually do fly radial control gliders.
Yeah.
So that initial approach is usually really very welcome. And if it's only one slope soarer, quite often we end up flying from the same place rather than having separation, so that we can talk to each other and they can keep an eye out on any of their guys going cross country. And it gives the opportunity for them to tap you on the shoulder and say someone's coming back, and gives you a much earlier warning of them arriving back on the slope. So that relationship can be really good and very helpful. So it is worth talking to people for certain.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think we've got ourselves into a bit of a them and us culture with other slope users and other users of whether it's mountain bikers, horse riders, or whatever. And the reality of it is a shared space. And by talking to people, you're more likely to get a better reaction. And we had a situation at Ivinghoe the other day where someone was flying an F3F plane and they had a little bit of a control problem with one of the ailerons. The linkage broke. I think he was diving a bit quick. He got a little bit of flutter, and he had control of it, but he wasn't completely confident, and he was coming into land. And there were a number of walkers, so I just stepped forward and say, "Oh, excuse me, he's just landing, but he's got a few problems." People could not have been more helpful. As soon as they became effectively this involved party and said, "Oh, we just said, oh, he's got a few technical problems just landing," they all just stood still and gave the guy loads of space. So it is amazing if you talk to people what it does. So good point. But I think with hang glider pilots, Ian, you're absolutely right. Quite often they are actually model flyers. When it gets too windy for hang gliding, they tend to fly quite often fly model pilot, or they've come from model flying and gone into hang gliding and paragliding. Oh, we've got another question. Let's have a look. I believe crow braking is the same as butterfly. I believe crow braking is the same as butterfly flaps. Okay, so what would ailerons asked Ian the question? What is ailerons up only called then, please? If you know the answer to that, that'd be really good.
Yeah, to be honest, I rarely use ailerons up only. I have to say, all my sort of aileron only aeroplanes, I tend to fly without any sort of air brakes. So I have to say I've never named them, but yeah.
Well, Ian Nichols he's made the comment in the Q&A, which is I believe crow braking is the same as butterfly. Down, flaps down, ailerons up. I think butterfly is flaps down, ailerons up, and crow is ailerons up only. But we've got some experts in the audience. Someone saying they're called spoiler-ons. Alan Dixon, for mixed use sites at our local site, we insist you use a spotter when a full size is in the air, as well as segregated landing zones. Do you agree this is a useful precaution? Yeah, I think it is a really useful precaution, but I think Ian's point is valid as well. I think it really depends on the conversation you're having with the hang glider pilots and what you've agreed with them. And it's, if you've got rules of the road or rules of the slope, and you both agree with those rules and you stick to them, you should be fine. I've flown a number of times at Bo Peep on my own late in the evening, and there've been 5 or 6 paragliding pilots there. And I've gone over and say, do you mind if I fly? And they go, no. And I said, shall I sit with you guys? And then I know when you're landing and when you're taking off, I'll do 20 minutes. And if your guys are going to fly, I'll sit down and let you guys go. And you end up, they start asking questions about the plane. So I really think it depends on your site and your way you want to do it and your relationship. I think having a spotter, especially if you're less, and we're going to talk a bit about it later, less confident about looking around and seeing what's going on around you when you're flying. Slope soaring is very important. You've got a good peripheral and field of view when you're flying, because take out the paragliders and hang gliders, you will have mid-airs with other models, and we'll talk a little bit about how to overcome that. So if you're a very confident pilot and you can look at your plane, look away, look around and see what's going around, you may not need a spotter. But we were at competition a couple of years ago at Long Min. They're not supposed to come over the top of us lower than 500 feet, and halfway through someone's flight, someone who's obviously run out a bit of lift came straight across the top of the flight line at about 120 feet. And the fact that one person's flying at a time in an F3F competition and there's loads of eyes in the skies, we spotted that and we were able to tell the pilot to come down low. So yeah, I think it's a good thing, but it really a little bit depends on your relationship and also how confident you are about surveying your environment. Okay, good points though. Thank you very much. Right. So teaching granny to suck eggs, but I'd see this so much when I go slope soaring. And it's not so much from experience slope soarers, but people back to this ill-prepared thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that I do when I go slope soaring, which makes my day better, makes it more endurable or enjoyable. So clothes are really important. And my dad used to take me slope soaring when I first started to fly, and it would be 20 degrees down in Middlesex or wherever we would live, and I would pack a sweatshirt and get in the car and go with him. We'd get to the top of the hill and it would be about 8 or 9 degrees with a chill factor on an August day with a 20 to 30 mile an hour. So having the right clothes, and we just see it so much, especially with guys who come from power clubs on away days, they just don't dress appropriately. Turn up, they've driven an hour and a bit from Cambridge or somewhere to get to Ivinghoe, and then after an hour or so, they say, I've got to go home, it's just too cold. So have a think about your layers of things. And one of the problems with dressing properly, I'll jump around on the points to be at the top of the hill, is if you've got to walk up the hill, you can get exceptionally hot when you get to the top and you sweat up, and then you sweat it up, and then you've got your hot layers on, and then what happens is you get really cold. So what I've learned over the years is I dress for walking, and then when I get to the top, I dress to be at the top of the hill. And I think it's quite an important thing, and I'll show you about how I get my planes up the hill in a minute. But one of the really big issues, even in the middle of the summer, is your hands. And you're standing on the front of the slope, you get cold hands, you can't fly for prolonged periods at all, 6, 7, 8 minutes maximum. And with a lot of modern transmitters, like a Jetty, for instance, they've got cast metal cases, so that classic thing about them getting really, really cold. So how you deal with your gloves and fly with gloves on, if you can, is really important. So I'll show you again a workaround for that. So we'll go on to the next slide and I'll show you some of the workarounds. So one of the big things that I see at slope soaring is a good number of models get broken walking up the hill. And a lot of people assemble their plane before they go slope soaring in the car park, walk across the hill, up across the hill, and they get exposed to high wind speeds. They've got a transmitter case in one hand and holding a model in another. Quite often, especially in the south of England, we're talking about chalk and mud mixed together, and the paths are really, really slippery. So people fall over it and they fall onto their planes. So the best thing you can do is buy yourself a model bag, and there's lots of different suppliers of them. I personally have never got on with any of the ones that are available through the model trade. So that is a snowball bag. It's a £100 snowball bag, which I got on eBay. It's an O'Shea snowball bag for £35. And that can take up to a 2.5 metre wing. They do one that you can take a 3 metre wing in it, and I can get 3 planes in there, ballast, and it flicks over your shoulder, and you can carry 3 planes, and I have the fuselages, the fins sticking out of the zip there on the left. If you fall over, which, as I say, I see on numerous occasions, it allows you to throw the bag away from you as you fall, and you're not going to fall on the plane. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I've seen it so many times. And then you can buy yourself some really expensive shooting gloves and cut for about 50 quid, or you can buy 15 or 12 pound tinslate gloves on eBay and cut some slots in them and stick your finger and thumb out. And that's how I fly in the winter to keep my hands cold. But you will still get cold hands. It doesn't matter. And so Dave actually introduced me to, on the right, it's not some sort of pleasure toy, but it's actually a hand warmer. And they're absolutely brilliant. They're available on Amazon and eBay, etc. And they come in different sizes. But if you notice, it's got a USB port on the top. So that's 4,000 milliamp battery effectively in there. So not only can I warm my hands with it, or I can actually put them in the back of those gloves and fly. So the back of my hands are warmed all the time whilst I'm flying. I can run a battery charger and recharge my plane up at the slope at the same time. So I would say those things, having a good model bag, having the right gloves, and ways of keeping your hands warm are really important on the slope if you want to fly and have a good day out and be able to fly continuously. Because once your hands go cold, you might as well forget it. You might as well go home. You'll never get the heat back into them. So we've got 3 questions up there. Let me just have a look. That's just back the ailerons thing. Right. So moving on. Just finally, again, for years, I used to sit on all different slopes when I used to go with Ian and Dave to competitions, and Dave would be sitting there in a deck chair, and I wondered how he would do it. And then I realised that he had a folding deck chair, and these are amazing. They're not cheap, but that on the right-hand side weighs 1.2 kilos, and it folds out into that deck chair. And if you're on a slope all day, it's very, very tiring. I would say that is an absolute must for anyone who goes slope soaring. It'll go in that model bag that I showed you. It's super light, very strong. They're rated at over 120 kilos support weight per person. So there's very few people that probably over 120 kilos that could maybe make it up to some of the bigger slopes. But I would just say actually for model flying, absolutely superb bit of kit. They're not cheap, but really, really good. All right, moving on. So trimming. Let me ask. Yeah, sorry,
just before you carry on. So I think there are a couple of things that I sort of would add to your survival kit, having spent 40 years as a slope rat. One of the things I do take quite often now, even though I'm not competing, is some polythene tubes to put over the wings. Because if you've walked up a slope and you've walked for half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, and it decides to rain, you want to keep the wings as dry as possible and keep water out of the aeroplane. And I put a ground sheet in my rucksack as well, because you can put yourself and the aeroplane underneath the ground sheet if you do get a squall going past. And I think a lot of the slopes on the south coast are fine, but some of the bigger slopes that people might venture out to in Wales, in the Peak District, it can be quite brutal in terms of the environment. It's a whole day in the sun, in the wind chill, can be quite sapping. So I also chuck in some energy bars and things like that and make sure that I've got a hydration source. So those things are really useful for sort of keeping the body together.
Well, and it's funny you say about a ground sheet. Dave was flying with a couple of guys down at Bow Peak the other day, and that's a site that suffers badly with ticks. So, one of the things you don't get when you're power flying is you don't tend to sit on the ground when you're not flying. You tend to fly, and there's probably deck chairs at a power field or whatever. when you go slope soaring, you're right, you're on the ground. So having a ground sheet to keep yourself dry, or in a particular case, some of those South Downs hills where there's quite an infestation of ticks, it's really good to either have a deck chair or have a ground sheet. I'm going to ask you the next question. So you just made a journey from slope soaring back into flying your plane on the flat field. Do you think there's any difference in the way that you would balance, trim, and set up a plane for the flat field versus flying at the slope?
So it is an interesting conversation. So I think in terms of the core CG position for the aeroplanes that I like to fly, there's very little difference. But I do have, I've always flown slightly different settings, flat field to slope. I think the aeroplanes I fly tend to be incredibly neutral, so I think the trim setting is fairly similar, but the flat field environment is very different to the slope environment. So in previous incarnations, I used to have a slope memory and a flat field memory in my radios. Now I just have, because we've got virtually unlimited flight modes in our radios, I just have a slope setting and a normal setting, if you like.
Okay. No, thank you. My take on it is that you should be trimming your plane to find the optimum C of G. And in the last GPS triangle one, John discussed in quite a little length about how you do a dive test and the zoom and the tuck under, etc. And you should spend some serious time, whether you fly on the flat field or the slope, getting the C of G of the plane right, so that the plane flies really well. But even more importantly, maybe than flying on the flat field, when you're flying a slope soarer, one of the things that you need to do, and someone really made the valid point earlier on about having a spotter, is that you do need to do things like look away to see where the other models are, or if you're flying on a mixed use site, whether or not something's going to enter the field of your field of vision, and actually you might lose your line of sight to the model. To be able to look away and look back is one of the most fundamental skills of slope soaring. And if your plane is not well trimmed and flies hands off, then you need to spend some serious amount of time getting it to a point where the CG is right and the trims are right, so that it will do that. It will be an absolute lifesaver for you. And it's apart from the plane making the plane easier to fly and low maintenance to fly, it allows you to park the plane for a moment, look to the left or right, and look back, and make sure you're okay to, let's say, dive down and do your maneuver, whatever you're going to do. But again, like a power site, you probably have to walk to the landing area. And if you can't look at the plane, look where you're walking, look back at the plane without the plane suddenly veering off and shooting off, you're going to have a real problem landing. So trimming and getting a really stable hands-off trim for your aeroplane is absolutely essential. And most manufacturers, when you buy a plane, will have a recommended CUG. I think anyone who's spent some time trimming a plane will realize that they're typically a little bit conservative. They tend to be a bit far forward, or they start at a forward position, and the CG can go further back if you want to optimize performance. But once you've got the plane set up and center of gravity is right, then it should fly really easily and hands off, so that, as I say, you can start to take other things in your environment around you. And then I'll ask Ian this question. I got my opinion. Once you got the COG right and you start putting ballast in, which is an absolute essential for most slope soaring models, because you need to be able to cope with the right wide wind range that you'll be flying in, would you change your center of gravity if you start putting ballast in, Ian?
So again, I think it's back to my earlier answer. My aeroplanes are set up so that they fly as you've described. They are absolutely at their best trim. They are no pilot input required. They will fly perfectly. If the pilot isn't interfering with them, they'll fly really well. They are stable, but at the right sort of neutral point. And again, all of my aeroplanes, I make sure that they are capable of having all their ballast variety in without having to alter the CG. So I think if you keep having to change your CG because of the ballast, then you haven't fundamentally set the aeroplane up correctly. Is my view. The balance of my aircraft is always correct. There are some aircraft which do require the CG changing, but nothing I fly would ever need to be balanced for ballast, because it is, the ballast sits around the CG.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that one of the biggest mistakes a lot of people make is they have an aerobatic slope soarer, or they have a sports model and it flies really nicely and lets out 25-mile-an-hour wind speed, and it's got capacity to put some ballast in, and as it gets windier and it starts to get blown around, they think, oh, I'll put some ballast in. Now, quite a lot of modern planes, molded planes, etc., or ARTF planes have ballast tubes in the wings, etc. So one of the things that people do is they put the ballast in, but they don't actually see whether or not the ballast tube, or where the ballast goes in the fuselage, actually relates to the center of gravity, which they have decided or trimmed to fly really well, which might be slightly different to the manufacturer's center of gravity. It might be further back, for instance. So the ballast tube actually might be in front of the center of gravity. So when you start putting ballast in, that starts to bring the center of gravity forward. Now, also, people have a fear of ballast, which is they put it in because they know they need to put it in to push the flight envelope of the plane and cope with the higher wind speed and the turbulence and make the plane more stable. But they actually do move the CG further forward. And then they start to fly and they start pulling back on the stick because the plane becomes sluggish because the center of gravity's moved further forward away from the center of effort. And then the plane starts to get tip-stalling and flick in. And then they blame the ballast for that. And the reality of it is what they've done is they've taken a stable, nicely trimmed model, added some ballast to it, and then changed the center of gravity. So very important, if you're putting ballast in your plane, to check that when you do put the ballast in, you don't change that super sweet spot that you've got to by all the trimming you've done with your trim and center of gravity. Really, really important. Well, go on again.
So I think Anthony Hollings has put a question in which relates to this conversation. So he's asked about DLGs at Belden. Seem to get better with some nose weight. Okay. So to be fair, if you applied weight at the center of gravity, the aircraft would handle exactly, or would feel the same as you are used to normally, but would overcome the increased wind that you're countering by putting a bit of nose weight in. But I accept that DRG, you might not have a ballast tube in. So as Greg was alluding to earlier, so I've spent a lot of money recently on an electric center of gravity and model weighing device, because it means that I can, certainly with longitudinal ballast tubes, put the aircraft on there and very carefully trim the ballast spacers to make sure that it's always the same CG, whatever ballast combination I put in. And some people go very complicated with their ballast and have massive spreadsheets. To be fair, I've always tended to be a bit simple with ballast. It's empty, it's about half full, and it's fully ballasted. And I just make sure that the aircraft's trim state is always correct, whatever the state of the ballast is. And then the aircraft will then fly pretty much in whatever wind you go out in. And it makes it very simple, and it means that it's also error-free.
Yeah. Just the final point I would make is you with ballast, you can certainly increase the flight envelope of the plane and increase its operating wind speed. But the reality of it, the DLG example at Belden is a classic. I've been up there and been 2-3 miles an hour, 5 miles an hour, and the DLG is the perfect plane, the only plane's flying. The wind starts to pick up and it can change very quickly there, and it can get up to 40 to 50. It can howl across the top of Belden Moor. You need a plane that is the right plane for the conditions. Doesn't matter how much ballast you put in it, eventually you'll over, if it's optimized for flying in light lift, Mother Nature will overcome the aerodynamics of the aeroplane. So, again, back to the beginning part of that preparation. Look at your weather forecast, look at XC. It gives 1 hour increments about how the wind speed increases. If you live in that area, you're going to go to flight Pule Hill and Nonce area. The weather can change so quickly there. You can go from having quite a benign day to a very windy day. Well, you need a DLG, and you need your 5 kilo aerobatic slope soarer or scale plane to cope with those conditions. Right, let's crack on. So aerobatics, it's just a little bit about aerobatics, because it's something that you see a lot of people doing on the slope, whether they've got big scale plane or whether they've got proper aerobatic plane, or they've got what we would call the sports planes, F3F planes that may be detuned a bit. And the nice thing about it is it's a way of practicing maneuvers, testing your skill and making improvement in flying, but it's not competitive. It's artistry in the sky, if you like, dancing in the sky. So it's certainly a great way to progress your skills. And when we were on the browser, there's a web page I showed. I can hand out at the end, or send out in the email. But there are lots of different styles, and it's influenced by what type of slope you've got, where you live in the world. And we talked in the first presentation, in the UK, we literally are gifted with a variety of slopes of different sizes and heights. And my French friends and my German friends I fly with, who obviously share a different sense of humour, but their English is superb. They say, of course, you English, you're lucky, you're gifted with wind. So we do suffer with a lot of wind here, which they don't in a lot of European countries. So the influence of the weather and the slope. So in the UK, one of the things that Dave was a great exponent of was designing aerobatic slope soarers, and he's just disappearing off now. I said that is that we've got a lot of lift, relatively short length of hills. So we tend to fly these things called kippers, which were the phase 5, the phase 6, days Aeolus, and now Arhis. They work really well on UK downland sites. In France, they have very low lift. They build very light planes, and I'll show you some pictures. I was warned at the beginning that people say, oh, sometimes we use initials and technical terms. So they use an expression in France, VTPR, which is 4 French words. But the translation of it is it's basically terrain hugging aerobatics. They fly very, very low weight aeroplane, very close to the ground because the lift is really light. And they literally fly inverted, feet off the ground, and do rolls. They have very specialized planes for it. And then the thing that's really become popular now, it's back to the Arhi, is planes like La Fiche and the Arhi, where they've got very fish-shaped fuselages, after the holy grail of slope aerobatics, which is to try to sustain knife edge with a non-powered aeroplane. And it's almost possible for short periods of time. And then if you're not into aerobatic slope soarers, and we'll show some pictures in a minute, then in Europe, the thing they're really into is semi-scale alpine soaring with big 4 or 5 meter planes like Alpinas, and they wish them about and do massive loops. Ian's got a Stingray, I've got a Stingray. That's a very popular plane in Europe, super fast, sort of looks semi-scale, but it's actually halfway between a scale plane and our kippers, if you like, our flat wing, very flat fuselage aerobatic slope soarers. So there's lots of different facets to aerobatic slope soaring, but it's something you can get into and really progress your flying and learn different styles and different maneuvers, and it's a real challenge for your flying. So I'll just move the slides on. So here's some planes. Top right there, that's a Stingray. So that weighs about 5.5, 6 kilos.
That one's 7 kilos.
7
in its
kilos.
underpants.
So it needs quite a good lift and a big hill to fly. That's superbly impressive. Big energy retention, big maneuvers. It's almost like it's got a motor on it. And then in the top left there, that's more typical of some of these modern, lighter, very flat-winged, large fuselage aerobatic slope soarers. Bottom right is Dave flying with a Raptor, which is an evolution for plane he designed. I would say that is the ultimate expression of a modern aerobatic aeroplane that's suitable for the UK. Most slopes in the UK, it's fairly light in construction, molded or fly in light lift, but you can put brass or tungsten in it, ballast it up and fly it in 40, 50 miles an hour. Absolutely superb aeroplane. And then, as I say, fish and chips. So big rage. The plane in the bottom middle slide, which is on the left, an Arhi and La Fiche, made out of EPP, incredibly light, very rugged. In California, I suppose this is where these planes really came from. They've got plenty of cliffs, but no wind. they fly 5-8 miles an hour, just gentle breezes. And they want, they watch us, they watch videos of YouTube of European flyers flying in amazing conditions, and they wanted to be able to fly aerobatics. So they've come up with a plane that will fly incredibly slowly, got massive control surfaces, a bit like a shocky, and will fly off these cliff sites they've got in 4 or 5 miles an hour. And there's loads of videos on YouTube. They're flying on literally on the promenade and in San Diego and places like that in just lightest of winds, and they've become very, very fashionable. So got 6 questions there, so I'm just going to take a natural yeah, so that's some good points. What 3 words? That's a really good thing to use. What 3 words? It's a piece of software, and if you get yourself into an emergency services situation, if you can have that app on your phone, if you just launch the app, it will give you 3 words where you are. If people don't know about it, because a lot of people struggle with grid references and things. So literally, if you say those 3 words to the 99 emergency, they know exactly where you are within 2 meters. Yeah, a big issue for slope soaring is massive windburn and sunburn. You need really high factors on the very, very true. Much more, it's a bit like skiing. It's much more easy to get sunburn on a slope than it is on a flat field. Is it permissible to fly model gliders on a ridge in the presence of full-size gliders? Well, there are examples of it, like the Long Mind, where there's an arrangement between the Model Soaring Association and the club. But then, for instance, if you live close to Dunstable Downs, you can't fly with agreement of the National Trust. We do not fly model aeroplanes at Dunstable Downs. It's just, there's too much volume of traffic. I think it really depends on the operating environment of the club and how many planes are flying, etc. Carlton Bank, I know there's a full-size gliding club at Carlton Bank, but they slope soar with agreement of the club. So it really depends on the slope and doing the right thing, which is going and liaising with the other slope users and seeing what their attitudes are towards it. Is a dive test still valid? It absolutely is the right way of doing a centre of gravity. And I would say, I would always do my dive test across wind rather than an into wind, but it is absolutely relevant on the slope as it is on the flat field, doing the dive test to get your centre of gravity right. Get yourself as high as you can, put the plane into a dive and see if it wants to tuck under or pull out, and start adjusting your centre of gravity accordingly. And obviously you don't want a plane that's going to tuck under the centre of gravity too far back. But conversely, I've seen a lot of people. Was involved in the testing of an aerobatic slope soarer for a manufacturer, and I spent a lot of time trimming it out. We wrote the instructions, and a lot of people bought them. They went and flew them, and they thought, well, CFG says 88 millimeters, but that's a bit worrying. I'll put it forward at 75. And they flew them, and a lot of people didn't like them, and I would get phone calls and say, oh, I don't like this plane, I think it's a load of rubbish. What you had written was not very good. So I said, well, I'll meet you at the slope and let's go flying. The first thing I do is check the centre of gravity, and when I found it was 1.5 inches too far forward, move it back, and it's completely transformed the aeroplane. So the dive test is the ultimate way of finding out whether the CFG is right. And it's about a little bit about personal preference in doing that trimming. A few more questions and I'll move on. Yes, that's Anthony. Good comment. So in F3B in the late 70s, there was some guys called the Seatar brothers, and they won the world championship a number of times with pretty much the first molded aeroplanes. Then they sort of gave up the sport, and the next guys that came along, and they had a plane called a Spartacus, and the Spartacus had a brass weight on a worm in the fuselage, and they were able to change with the electric motor the CFG as the plane flew. And so what they did was they moved the centre of gravity back for duration, and they moved it forward for the speed and distance task. So what they would do is they would winch launch with the CFG back to give them a very high crossover point between the centre of gravity and centre of effort. When they wanted the plane to go fast, they would move the CFG forward. And when they wanted the plane to thermal really efficiently, they would move the CFG back again. So it has been done, but I would say modern aeroplanes are so well designed that really one centre of gravity is where you want to fly it, really.
Just to build again on that, Greg, I think anything that's modern era, so I would say 90s onwards, is unlikely to benefit from that, because the variable centre of gravity on the Spartacus was predicated on a section with a particular camber and a particular set of lift behavior. Most of the things that we fly, particularly on the slope, tend to have a much lower camber than previously, and we're using a variable trailing edge to gain the benefits that the Spartacus was trying to get around, which is adapting your aeroplane to make it multitask, multi-purpose.
Yeah, we've got a living wing now, which those guys didn't have the benefit of. The quality of servos and construction. I mean, they were molded, those planes, but they were still nowhere as good as the modern planes. And also, as you say, in the Dirt Plug, sections have moved on tremendously. He's a fantastic airfoil designer, and we've got planes that really truly are multitask aeroplanes. Right, let's crack on. So just on VTPR, this is a typical VTPR plane. It's probably about 2.5 meters in wingspan, and as you can say, one of the really big fashions that the French have come out with is these high degree of control movements in the rudder and elevator, and they do flip maneuvers. So they'll fly along and put that elevator full up, and the plane will literally just do a tumble. It's like a falling leaf through the sky. So again, a little bit like some of the power aerobatics you see with 3D 100-seat IMAC planes. It's very, very different to the way we fly in the UK. We tend to fly fast. We've got plenty of lift. Tend to fly planes like the Stingray, the Raptor, Phase 5, Phase 6. And we tend to have big inertia in the manoeuvres. And again, a lot of people tend to fly Alpina type airplanes or F3F, F3X airplanes. Whereas in France, they do suffer with a lack of wind, unlike us. And these planes are absolutely optimized. But this trick tail plane is something that's become very, very popular. And it's quite a feat of mechanical engineering to build that and get it to work. And it be precise enough that it centers really well and maintains your trim, but has that level of deflection for it. Okay, moving on. So just some sort of points. So with slope soaring, if you want to have a really good day out, just remember it is a shared space. Unless you're very lucky, like the guys at the Leek and Moorland Soaring Association, where they've got private land, there's no footpaths about it. You have to think about all the other people that were there. Do your research. You go onto YouTube, go onto Google, look at the hang glidings. There's so much information, and I've looked at that and I found slopes I never knew existed that are public access slopes that people don't slope soar on, that we can slope soar on just by doing your research. But it's important if you're going to go up there to know the rules of the slope. And Tan Hill, Milk Hill is a classic case where anyone who's ever flown there has probably met the local person that masquerades as from someone from Heritage England, and will tell you that we're not allowed to fly there and he's going to get the police. And he's one of Britain's great eccentrics. But if you know the rules, and I've been challenged by him twice and said, well, no, that's not true, and let's just get the police here and sort it out. He just disappears off. So it's really important that if you're going to go and use sites, that you know what your rules are. So as I say, if you looked on that slope at the Coombe Gibbet site, the model flying area is designated. So know your rights, know what you're allowed to do. So if you're flying and some hot-headed paraglider or hang glider pilot comes over and says you're not allowed to fly here, when I've been to slopes where there's shared use, so I've actually quite often printed out the hang glider information off the web page, and so it says on your web page that we're allowed to fly to the right of this mark. Nont-Serra is a classic case of that on the moors there, where the paragliders are supposed to fly to the right and the models are supposed to fly to the left. That's all in stone. That's all written in places. So it's really good to have that. And then we sort of go down, and we'll talk about friction-free flying and things in a minute. But you're going to get conflict between flyers as well, because you've got people flying different styles of aeroplanes. You've got people flying valuable, large-scale models that eat up a lot of sky, that take up a lot of slope. You've got guys flying combat aeroplanes trying to knock each other out of the sky in the same bit of airspace. And my advice would be, with all of that, is talk to each other and agree when you're going to fly. It's a well-known fact that if you're doing something which requires a high degree of dexterity and sort of mental capacity to do it, if you start doing something for more than 14, 15 minutes, you actually get worse at it towards the end of the 14 or 15 minutes than you do if you continue to do it. You're better to land and have a cup of tea and think about what you're doing and go back up. So I always fly when I go to a site. If I'm flying an aerobatic plane and I'm coming down fast and doing loops and things, and there's guys with really nice sail airplanes, I'll go over and say, when do you want to fly? You know, why don't you fly here? I'll wait on the ground. When you land, I'll go up. Let's have some slots effectively. In the same way as if you were an indoor power flyer, you wouldn't fly your vapors with your shockeys. You know, you would agree to have 4 or 5 minute slots, and the vapors would fly, and then the shockeys would fly, and then the helicopters would fly. It's the same on the slope. You know, try and talk to each other and agree when you're going to fly. And one of the worst things out is, and it's one of the facets of slope soaring, is that of course you've got limitless lift if the wind blows, and you can actually fly for hours. And one of the problems with it is people do come along with a middle phase, they're starting to crack their flying, they're really enjoying it, and they will sit literally in the middle of the slope for an hour, and other people can't fly. So it's all about interaction and talking to each other, and building a sort of a routine where you say, well, we'll fly for 10 minutes. I only need to fly for 10 minutes. If I'm doing continuous slope aerobatics, at 10 minutes, I've mentally had enough. I set myself a timer so that about 8 minutes, my timer goes off and I think, I've got 2 more minutes and then I will be frazzled. So I'm going to land. So anyone who is, who knows me, flies with me, will think, well, I'm not going to launch now because he'll be down in 10 minutes. And then one of the things you need to think about if you're a power club is away days. And I've seen it at a number of slopes. I've gone to fly, let's say at Roundway, and you've got the locals flying, and you get 15 or 20 people turn up from a power club with their slope soarers. And they're slope soarers as well as power flyers. That is quite an intrusion on the locals. And if you're going to do something like that, it's always good to liaise with the local club and say, hey, we're coming. And they'll put something maybe on their Facebook webpage and tell the other guys that are flying, well, the club from so-and-so is coming down. There could be 10 or 12 people. But if you imagine if you're a power flyer and you were flying and suddenly 20 people turned up at your power site to fly as guests from another club en masse, it might well annoy you. So this sort of, I think it's quite important to be sensitive about. As I say, it's really simple. Communication is key to all this. We've got mixed use, we've got the general public, we've got cyclists, we've got horse riders, and we've got other. But more importantly, and from a safety perspective, we've got other air users, and the air navigation order is really explicit in what it says about that. And we've got to comply with, the safety and make sure we don't have an accident, because we will lose these sites otherwise. So I probably offended most people who slope soar tonight with some of the things I said. My disclaimer is, been doing it 45 years. I've been really lucky. One of the first people I met slope soaring was Dave Woods, his brother Graham, and I've met some other people, and I've had some fine examples of modelling, engineering, and flying to learn from. So I feel really lucky that it's something that I've met some fantastic people and done some, really good flying. There's a huge wealth of audience knowledge here tonight. So I think, what we'll do is we'll move on and open up the mics almost and let people make comments or ask questions. But I mean, I've only scratched the surface of this. We haven't talked about F3F. We haven't talked about cross-country flying. There's just so much more that we could talk about slope soaring. We got the question about dynamic soaring. We can discuss that a bit more. So I think, I've 4th week in a row that I've wobbled on and probably said too much. But let's have some more questions and answers.
Greg, can I just come in there and say I didn't see many complaints over the last three weeks, so I don't expect too much today. You might get a bit of abuse afterwards, but you're always welcome, and I think you've got plenty of other topics to cover over the next 6 or 12 months, whenever we're going to keep this going. Whilst I've got the mic, just a couple of things I want to do before everybody starts to leave for their home lives. Next month, we're going to start our 2 sessions a month. We are all out flying a lot more now, I hope. Post the latest lockdown, we should be a little safer, and obviously we're going to try and get out a lot more. So we're going to run 2 sessions a month. What we'll do is we're going to put all the latest sessions on the website, and also we're going to leave an email address on there, please. So if anybody wants to see any discipline, not necessarily silent flight, combat control line, free flight, if they want to leave some ideas on the website for us or via the email, we will, Andy and I, or Andy and myself will look to try and arrange this for you for the forthcoming months, and yeah, see if we can keep everything going. One more question on there, Greg, while I've got the mic. Stellanor asks, do you have any links of the French falling leaf glider?
Yeah, and Ian's offered to, but I mean, what I'll do is actually, but whilst Ian's answering it, I will start sharing again.
Okay.
So
go on, Ian.
yeah, so the plane's called Oxid Evolution. So the Oxid was probably available from Silence Model in France. They do some lovely aeroplanes, but at the moment they're not doing any of their VTPR type aeroplanes. But I think the designer is probably going to get quite a lot of pressure to put a short kit or put the details up. I spotted the aeroplane on a Facebook group called VTPR and Slope Aerobatics, and it is a nicely made thing. And if the fuselage and wing set becomes available, it's something I probably would like to add to my collection. And picking up on something that Greg said, as well as using just sort of the ordinary internet, there are some really good Facebook groups around some of the more niche aspects of slope soaring.
Yeah, Facebook's very bittersweet, and you know, if you're in a profession like teaching or the police or NHS, it can be a no-go area.
Yeah.
Which is a shame, because for all of its bad press, in terms of, I would say, for me in the last couple of years, Facebook's been a fantastic source of model flying, but in particular, there's some great soaring, whether it's slope soaring or F5B or F3B or whatever it is, GPS triangle racing. There's some fantastic pages. Can people see my screen? Is that sharing with everyone?
At the moment.
Not at the moment.
No.
Right, hang on a second. Here we go. Is that sharing now? Is there a web page up?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ian talking about Facebook and things. This is a very good page, and if you come down, you will see there's lots of videos and things. If you want to get into slope aerobatics, they've got plans, links, etc. So that's a really good page to get into if you're interested in slope aerobatics and you don't want to go on Facebook. Okay, I think we're done. Let's have a look. Any more questions? Do you have links? That's it.
David Fogg's got his hand up, so I'll bring him in so he can unmute himself if he wishes. And we'll stop the screen here. David, if you had your hand up, if you want to ask a question, you'll need to unmute though.
He's gone to make a cup of tea.
There you go.
Yeah. It's certainly been the phrase, isn't it, of the past 18 months.
I've unmuted now. It's Dave Fogg.
Hi there.
Hello?
Hey, David.
You mentioned Nonceras near Huddersfield. Unfortunately, it is no longer a flying site. There is a massive
right?
on the edge now. So
There's a massive what?
Car park.
Oh, okay.
The hang gliders go there now.
Do the hang gliders fly there, or they've been stopped as well?
No, they've been stopped as well.
Wow, that's such a shame. I mean, that's a classic case where, for me, that's one of the best southerly facing slopes that I've ever flown in the UK.
Yeah, well, as I say, I live just 5 miles away from it, and it's gone.
Well, thank you, David, for telling us that. And that's where, back to my, point, I would, because I'm so used to just rocking up there and flying, I wouldn't even research that. I would have gone and turned up and wondered why on earth there was a load of houses built on the top there.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, David. Really good point.
Well, I think we'll probably, Andy, do you want to stop the live feed?
Yes, I can do, yeah.
Sounds like a
going
good...
back about Nonceras, isn't that Marsden Moor?
Yes, that's Marsden Moor up that way. But no, not Marsden Moor. No, Nonceras is further over.
Ah, right, okay.
It's
Because
off
I know they're still flying at
the old
Marsden.
Huddersfield Road.
So,
If you're driving
Anyway,
on the M62, Andy, and there's that bit in the M62 where the road splits and the guy wouldn't move out of his farmhouse.
yes.
If you look to the right, that's the north side of Nontsera. You can northeasterly side, there's a hill there, but on the other side is Nontsera.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah. Near the pub then. There's a pub called Nonsense.
Yeah, that's exactly just up the road from there. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Because a bit further on is where they fly at Marsden Moor, isn't it?
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Because they were flying there the other week when I drove past. That's all. Right. We ought to say good night to everybody on YouTube. So I'll stop